For the last section of Chapter 10 on intelligence, we're actually going to talk about a bunch of different influences on intelligence. And just like at the very beginning of this chapter, when we talked about the fact that, hey, a lot of these concepts are going to apply across multiple different kinds of studies. So, talking about our psychometrics and how they're going to be useful when we talk about personality, the same thing actually holds here at the end because we're going to talk a little bit about the genes and environment and interactions between the two that can play a role with intelligence and other psychological traits. It's not going to be specific to intelligence, though we will then consider exactly how they apply to intelligence and then look at other things that can influence intelligence in particular. But the start of this section is a lot more broad and general. So we're going to start by talking about nature or nurture, the standard debate. And people always talk about it as this debate of is it nature or is it nurture? Is it our biological nature? Is it something innate and genetic? Or is it all about our external environment, how we are nurtured and raised? Which is it? And of course, it's not really a debate that has a one side or the other answer. In fact, for pretty much all the traits we're ever going to talk about, we're going to talk about a combination where, yes, there is going to be some underlying biological component, but there is also going to be some other modifying environmental contribution that also ends up playing a role here. So when we say nature or nurture, the answer is both. So intelligence, along with pretty much all of our other psychological traits, are going to come from some innate characteristic, our underlying genes and biological stuff, as well as our unique experiences, the stuff that we encounter in our environment. So both are going to be involved, and we actually do need to consider both. And while we do think of sort of this idea of underlying genes influencing our traits as a more modern perspective, the idea of having some biological predisposition is by far, or it's not even close to being a new concept. So if we go back to the Greek philosophers, Plato actually suggested that people are born with our innate abilities and aptitudes, things that would make us good for particular professions, particular roles within the community. This also is something we talked about in relation to Francis Galton, who was talking about our intelligence tests and saying that there is this biological component because families tend to be similar in their intelligence scores. Though, of course, we had said that there were some problematic assumptions there because the environment was not considered in those cases. But the idea that, yeah, there is some underlying innate component is definitely not new. And if we're going to talk about this sort of innate underlying predisposition towards certain aspects of a trait, we have a couple of concepts that should also be mentioned. So some of this might end up being reviewed, some of this stuff is going to continue to be relevant, but we're going to talk about evolution and natural selection, where evolution is going to be a gradual change in our heritable traits within a population of individuals over time. So for some components here, some important things, when we talk about heritable traits, we are specifically telling us that, these traits have some genetic component, something that we can inherit from our parents. So the idea being that this trait is something that we can have passed between the generations. And of course, evolution is all about having these traits change in their sort of likelihood of occurring within a population for a bunch of different reasons. So we can start looking at things like, are we seeing, say, increases in intelligence over time? If so, then maybe evolution is occurring. We, as of course, are always going to want to consider the fact that it's not just genes and there's all sorts of other stuff going on. But yeah, seeing a change in a particular population where a trait adjusts over time is our evolution. And of course, if we're talking evolution, how do we start seeing certain traits becoming more or less common in a population? Well, natural selection is the process that makes evolution happen. And we always talk about natural selection as the survival of the fittest, but that's a pretty big oversimplification. And the reason for this is we're talking about more than just the best survive. In fact, we're talking about more probabilistic things. So this is a process where, again, with our heritable traits, traits that have genes that influence the expression of that trait, um, traits that are beneficial to survival make individuals more likely to survive and reproduce in that population at the time. And if you survive longer and produce more offspring, you pass on more of your genes. And if your offspring are now in that population and you had more offspring than somebody who didn't survive and thrive, well, now your genes are going to make up more of that population. So we're gradually going to see that the genes that you've passed on are going to make up more and more of that population. More individuals in that population will have those genes and therefore are more likely to have the trait that those genes influence. So we always stress that genes are the things that are sort of carried forward and allow these traits to be acted upon. But natural selection technically is acting on the physical traits themselves. So we're not directly impacting the genes, it's an indirect thing. But if we say that we have a gene that influences intelligence, which we don't, but we have this gene and it makes us smarter. So those who are smarter tend to gather more food. They tend to live longer. They tend to find better mates. In that case, they're more likely to pass on their gene, and their children are therefore more likely to be smarter. And because they are smarter, they are more likely to pass on their genes. So we're saying that the natural selection process is acting on whatever trait we see, whatever's expressed externally, but it ends up having an impact on those internal things, our genes running behind the scenes. So we actually have terms that help us quantify this. So when we talk about those external or observable traits, we're talking about the phenotype. And yes, we can talk about the phenotype of intelligence, and we can quantify it using, say, an IQ test. But a phenotype is a little bit easier to visualize when we talk about things like having brown hair. So an individual having brown hair is showing the phenotype of brown hair. Why do they have brown hair? Well, there's probably a bunch of different reasons. And that's because our phenotypes, that external expression, is produced by that combination of our underlying genetic factors, which we actually call our genotype, because it's the genes that we have. And it's produced by the environmental forces that act upon us. And because it's never as simple as genes and environment, there's also an interaction between the two, where our environment can activate and deactivate genes, and our genes can make us more or less likely to be in certain environments, so it gets messy. But we're just saying phenotype is from a combination of our genes and our environment. So we can talk about the genes that we have, but how those genes are expressed can end up being modified based on other stuff. So you might have two parents that have brown hair, and they give you a trait, a gene that's going to make you more likely to have brown hair. But maybe you're in an environment where you don't have the right kinds of nutrients from your diet, and you're not able to produce the pigments that you need to have brown in your hair. So maybe your hair is white because there's no pigment at all. In that case, we'd see that, yeah, you had the genotype that set you up to have brown hair, but things lacking in your environment meant that you didn't actually express it the way that we would have thought from your genes. So the environment has had an influence on the expression. Our genotype is not directly causing that phenotype. So we need to consider the fact that other stuff can play a role. So when we talk phenotype, we're talking about those observable traits, whether it's something physical like having brown hair, or something a little bit more psychological, talking about, say, intelligence, or when we get to it later, personality. So just some terms to get familiar with. Before we move on too much further, I do want to take a quick pause and talk about some very important concepts, because it's all well and good to say that things are influenced by both genes and the environment. But of course, people always ask questions about, well, how much of a particular trait is going to be influenced by genes and environment. So we're going to pause and talk about a couple of different metrics that are fairly common when we're starting to look at genes and environment and how they can influence certain traits. Now, these terms have very, very specific usages. So I have the slides devoted to just these, and we're going to talk about an example. So we're going to spend a bit of time here. The first thing that I do want to point out is while we're going to talk heritability and heritability coefficients, we've already talked about the term of something being heritable, or something where we talk about maybe heredity. Anytime we're using those other terms, so something being heritable, we're saying that it's something that can be inherited. It's something that gets passed on biologically from parents to children. So with heritability, it has a specific connotation where we're trying to quantify sort of what's being passed on, or I guess the effect of the thing that's being passed on. So the reason I'm specifying this is when we talk about something being heritable, it's a little bit more loose fitting. But when we talk heritability in terms of genetics, it has a very specific definition. So before I ramble, what's the actual definition here? Heritability is a measure where we're trying to describe how much of the variation of a particular characteristic or trait within a population can be attributed to genetic differences within that population. Now, there are a lot of very specific things there. So if we're asking, okay, step one, we're looking at a population. So a population is going to be our interbreeding group of individuals. So we can talk about for all of the people in this country or in this city or on this island or something like that. So we're going to define what our population is. And then we're going to say, okay, so within this population, this group of individuals that we've chosen, what's our characteristic? Nice and easy, we'll go with height, and I'll use that example again later on as well. So there are people who are very tall and people who are very short. So our trait is height, and the variation in that characteristic, in that trait, is how much of a difference we see between the very short and the very tall. So within that population, within that specific group, that difference between the shortest and the tallest, how much of that difference can we explain with the genetic differences in the population? That's specifically what we're asking. A lot of people will falsely assume that when we talk about heritability and we're saying, all right, we have a 0.5 heritability coefficient, they're like, perfect, 50% of our height is genetically determined. No, that is a false way to interpret it. If we had a 0.5 heritability coefficient, we'd be specifically saying that for height, about 50% of the variation between the tallest and the shortest individuals in our population can be tied to a genetic influence. So it is very specific. It is specific to that population. It is only able to explain variation, and it can change over time. So we need to be very precise with these things. So heritability is all about how much of that variation in the population can we explain genetically, and we use our heritability coefficients to do so. Now, these heritability coefficients are on the surface going to look very, very similar to what we talked about earlier with correlations. The biggest difference here is with our heritability coefficients, because we are trying to compare and to sort of evaluate a single trait, we only can have positive values. So when we mention correlations, we have positives and negatives, and we're looking at the relationship between two separate measured values. So it's very, very different from what it is we're actually looking at. But our heritability coefficients can be interpreted fairly similarly. So you can frame it mentally as a positive only correlation, more or less. If you get into like the calculations and the statistics and all of that, it's a lot more complicated and not the same, but we're interpreting them the same. We're going to treat them similar, and that's all we really need to know here. But that heritability coefficient is specifically going to be telling us about how much of the variation for our particular trait of interest within our particular population of interest can be attributed to genetic differences within that specific population. Sometimes you'll see them called heritability estimates. It's fine. When we're looking at these, though, we're, like we said, similar to our correlations. Our correlation coefficients are R's. In this case, we're going to have something between 0 and 1. So heritability only goes positive, only between 0 and 1. But if we were looking at a correlation coefficient, we'd have between -1 and +1. But just like with those correlation coefficients, heritability coefficients are going to say that the larger the magnitude of our score, the more this trait is related to genetics within our specific population, and specifically for that variation. We're going to sort of assume all of that in the background, so I don't have to keep saying the whole thing all at once. But if we have 0 as our heritability coefficient, we are saying that for a particular trait in a particular population, none of the variation in that population could be explained by genes. If we said that our heritability coefficient is 1, then we're saying that all of the variation in that population can be explained by genes. So all or nothing in that case, usually we're going to find something in the middle. And for these coefficients, we're typically going to see fairly lower levels when we look at more sort of psychological traits. So when we look at something like personality, having a heritability coefficient of 0.2 or 0.3, we're pretty happy with that. Even though looking at it, we'd think, well, that's not a super strong relationship. That's not a ton of that variation explained. But for something as abstract as personality, that's pretty typical. When we get into intelligence, we're going to start seeing higher heritability coefficients. But if we went into more physical traits, things like height are actually much, much higher. So height, I think, can be as high as 0.8, depending on sort of what you're looking at. And then another thing to mention here, because we're talking heritability and heritability coefficients, you're often going to see something called a concordance rate, which once again is going to be interpreted pretty much the same way as these heritability coefficients, but they're pulled from a slightly different source. So first off, if we were looking at a heritability coefficient for intelligence, we'd basically be considering something like our IQ score or something like that, where we have a continuous variable. So we're going to have an IQ somewhere between, say, 0 and 200. I don't know what the extremes are, with our average of 100, which we'll see later. So you can fall anywhere along that continuum. So with our heritability coefficients, we can calculate them knowing about that continuum. As we've seen with psychology, though, it's not always going to give us a continuous measured variable. If we're looking at something like, do you have this diagnosis? The only options are yes or no. And so when we talk concordance rate, instead of talking about correlating to continuous variables, we actually have to look at the odds of two individuals having a diagnosis, a same diagnosis. So when we start talking about twin studies, our concordance rate is going to say something like, if twin A has diagnosis X, how likely is twin B to also have this diagnosis? And then what we do is interpret this where the higher the likelihood of both twins having it, the more certain we are that there's a genetic component here. So same basic logic where a concordance rate of 0 says that if twin A has a diagnosis, we have no idea if twin B has it too. Whereas a concordance rate of 1 is going to tell us that if twin A has it, twin B pretty much always has it too. And then, of course, somewhere in the middle is going to tell us the likelihood. So 0.5 is like a 50-50 chance. So as we start seeing sort of increases in genetic relatedness, we'd see that there's more similarities with these concordance rates if genes play a role in that particular trait. So again, the logic here being that the concordance rate is just a number that's telling us how strongly genetics are contributing to our trait of interest in particular situations. So I mention them all together because even though our correlations are different from our heritability coefficients, which are different from our concordance rates, they all end up being interpreted fairly similarly. So we're lumping them all together because from this point forward, we can have them mentioned fairly often, and we just sort of are assumed to know what they mean. So if I tell you that this particular trait has this particular concordance rate under these conditions, I'm actually giving you an indication of how much we think genes are involved in the thing we're talking about. Now, for this, these are going to be two thought exercises that are meant to help us with visualizing that heritability coefficient and exactly what the number is telling us. This one is specifically from the textbook. So I just took the textbook figure and I have their sort of descriptor for it, but I've also included on the next couple of slides my own example that makes a little bit more sense to me. So I'm going to give you both. So for our textbook example here, we're looking at 4 different rectangles, A, B, C, and D. And the rectangles have different areas. So A is much larger than C. So we know that they have variation in their area. So the question of how much of the difference in the areas of these different rectangles is due to their width and how much is due to their height, we can actually answer that question. Because they're all the same height, then none of the variation here is due to differences in height. But because there's lots of variation in width, we can answer that, yeah, all of it is due to their width. That's all well and good, but if we asked a question of, say, for rectangle A, how much of rectangle A's area is due to height and how much of its area is due to its width, well, our textbook says, well, that's a silly question, and we can't really answer that because we're just talking about the height and width of one thing. So we can't really pick apart, oh, half of it's contributed by this or that. It's not really a question that's answerable. So in that case, yes, we can ask about variation across all of these things, and we can look at how they're similar and different and what leads to those similarities and differences. But we can't look at one thing and make sort of this broad claim about relative contributions. As I said, the textbook example is not something that clicks with me right away. So while I did read their example as is from their notes, I do have my own thought exercise, so this one might work better for you. So if I say that we have an island, it's an isolated island, it has a particular population, and people are taller or shorter. So within this population, we might say that, all right, the difference between the tallest and the shortest person, that variation, maybe 50% of it is because of the variation in the genes within our population. Fantastic. We've gotten ourselves a heritability coefficient of 0.5. And we can say that for this population at this time, with our particular knowledge, we know exactly what that coefficient is. But if we say that a new group of individuals comes in, and now these new individuals are going to have, maybe they have a disease, disease X, that makes it so that they grow taller than they should because something stimulating the release of growth hormones. Doesn't matter. They have something that's affecting their systems that makes them taller. And now, all of a sudden, we've introduced something in the environment that is making people much, much taller. Or if they don't have the new disease, then they're much, much shorter. So in this case, we have more variation, even though overall the genetics of the population hasn't really changed, the environmental components have changed. So before, half of our differences from tall to short were explained by genetic contributions and genetic variation. Now, more of that variation in the population is actually caused by something environmental, by a disease that's come in. So in that case, we'd actually say that even though the genes haven't changed all that much, our heritability coefficient gets smaller. So instead of 0.5, maybe we're at 0.2. And that's just because if something hadn't be sort of explained with our genetic contributions and our genetic variation within our population, well, then it must be coming from environmental contributions to that variation. So if we increase that environmental variation, we then decrease the variation that's explained by the genetics. And this can go the other way too. If we had people who come in that have genes that make them very, very tall and other genes that make them very, very short, if we're specifying that we have a stronger genetic influence, those people coming in can change that heritability coefficient to a higher value, maybe 0.6 or 0.7, because now we're saying, oh, new genes have come in, and now we can explain more of the difference between the tallest and the shortest through these genes that are present. So in this case, we can talk about increasing or decreasing our heritability coefficient specifically because of, well, the change in environmental contributions or the change in genetic contributions as our populations change. And this also helps illustrate the fact that isolated populations are going to sort of change if new people come in. And I guess also the fact that we can calculate this in this one location, but if we go elsewhere, maybe somewhere else does or doesn't have that particular disease, their heritability coefficients will be completely different. So even though whenever we start talking about sort of facts and figures in terms of a particular trait and its heritability coefficients, textbooks tend to report a single number, which is misleading because different populations will have slightly different values. So when we see a table that just has a single heritability coefficient for, say, intelligence, that's actually going to be a value that's calculated across multiple different studies and multiple different populations. We basically just have an average. So keep that in mind when we're looking at some of the tables, because the population itself is very, very important in the long run. And you might be a little bit nervous if we're talking about these heritability coefficients and concordance rates and all of these different values. Yes, you can go in and calculate them using very specific formulas and designs and stuff like that, but we definitely will not be doing so. Instead, we're just going to understand the basic logic behind how do we tell if something is being influenced by genes or by the environment, or just one or the other or both. So we're going to talk logic rather than calculation. So if we're asking the environment or genetics question, we say, all right, we have two organisms that are raised in the exact same environment, but they're going to display different phenotypes. They have different physical traits. Then we'd say that, all right, because the environment is exactly the same, but they're showing up differently, there must be differences in genetics. So I'm going to hop to our next slide because this one here is saying we have two different places, two different environments. Here we have poor quality soil, and we have plants here. One plant is shorter than the other. So they're both raised in a really crappy environment that has very few nutrients. And so because of that, neither of them is getting sort of more nutrients than the other. So the taller plant must have something in its genes that are leading to this variation. It must have something that makes it taller. And the short one must have something that doesn't make it taller. Same thing down here though, we're seeing with fertile soil. All right, both of these plants were planted in soil that has lots and lots of nutrients. But because they're in the same environment, one is not getting more nutrients than the other. They're having the exact same environmental experience. So if one plant is taller than the other, then it must be because there's some difference in their genetics. So this one is taller because it has genes that predispose it to be taller. Because again, if we're saying that phenotype comes from a combination of our genes and our environment, and within this one plot of land, we're holding the environment constant, the only place that variation can come from is our genes. Again, obviously an oversimplification, but that's our base logic, at least as much as we need it for this class. So, all right, if we're raising people in the same environment or plant, and we're seeing differences in their phenotype, in their physical expression, then there must be genetic differences because we've held the environment constant, and the only other place our differences can come from are their genes. Perfect. But what if we know that two organisms have the same gene? So plants, this is really easy because you can have, say, true breeding plants that have exactly the same genetics. All right, let's plant two genetically identical seeds in different environments. What happens then? So the genes can't vary. And we've said our phenotype is coming from our genes and our environment. So if we vary the environment but not the genes, and we see that the environment differences have affected our phenotypes, then we know that the environment has some influence on that trait. Again, back to my silly corn example here. So if this plant and this plant are both from the same seeds, they're genetically identical, but we see that being in a poor soil makes it shorter and being in a rich soil lets it grow taller, then we'd say that the difference between this plant and this plant, the difference between those two phenotypes, is due to their differences in the environment. They can't have genetic differences because we know that they are genetically identical, so the differences are actually due to the environmental differences. So the logic here, and of course, we're going with the most simple interpretation, we're sort of going with the extremes, where here, the environment, we're saying that the environment does not change, and therefore differences have to be because of the genes. Between the two, we're saying the genes are exactly the same, and therefore the difference between this and this has to be the different environments. Sort of that's the most basic way of saying that. So again, if we're saying, yes, we know they're genetically identical, but they're still showing two different phenotypes when they're raised in these different environments, the environment must be what's producing that difference in those phenotypes, in how we see the trait. And of course, if we end up seeing a situation where both genes and the environment can end up sort of having an influence on our phenotypes, that's completely normal. We do often see that both can play a role, but a test or a design, kind of like this one here, allows us to ask the question of, does genetics matter? So if all of the plants that we raise in poor soil, regardless of their genetic components, if all the plants are always the exact same height, then we'd say that this is completely environmentally influenced. This phenotype comes from where it's raised, not from its genes. Or if we found that being in rich soil versus poor soil, all the plants are the exact same height, then we'd say that the environment doesn't matter. The differences must come from then the environment doesn't matter. Everything is due to their genes. So yeah, we can kind of frame it in opposite directions. And if talking about this in terms of plants planted in rich or poor soil doesn't quite do it for you, we will have sort of human examples talking about comparing individuals raised in similar versus different environments momentarily. This is just a visual to get us started. Now, if we do want to start looking at sort of the relative contributions of genes and the environment, we do have to have a little bit of an understanding about the concept of genetic relatedness. Because while with plants, it's pretty easy to know that, all of these seeds are genetically identical, with humans, it's not that straightforward. So typically, when we start looking at individuals that are related to one another, we're often going to find like a 50% genetic relatedness. So if we look at a parent and their child, they're going to share about 50% of their genes. If we looked at, what's the best way to say this? Okay, the way that I like to think of this, so at least this is what works for me, is that if we look at a family tree, if we are within one step of each other, there's usually about a 50% genetic similarity. So a parent to their child, 50%. A sibling to their other full biological sibling is about 50%. But if we take an extra step, so if we go from grandparent to grandchild, so grandparent to parent to grandchild, that's 2 steps. Now we're going to have 50%, or sorry, 25%. Oh dear, numbers are not my forte. So every extra step we take, we're going to have half as much shared genetic material. And for us, we don't really care about any of these sort of parent and child, parent and grandparent and grandchild. The one that we only care about are our twins. And this is a special case because there are 2 types of twins. We have identical or monozygotic twins, as well as dizygotic or fraternal twins. And you can use these terms interchangeably, but we'll see that they have differing levels of genetic relatedness. So if we look at our representation here, our identical twins, they're called monozygotic twins, specifically because they come from a single fertilized egg. So they come from a single zygote that through the process of division early on, right after fertilization, there's sort of an oops, and these cells don't quite stick together. So instead of this single fertilized egg turning into a single individual, we actually end up with two genetically identical individuals. So because our identical twins came from the same fertilized egg, they share all of their genes. In contrast, fraternal twins or dizygotic twins come from two separately fertilized eggs, so they form two distinct zygotes. They only share 50% of their genes because they're effectively like regular siblings that just happen to be born at the same time. So because we don't have this special case of a single fertilized egg splitting and giving us two identical individuals, we only have about 50% shared genes here, and that then gives us the ability to compare between individuals that have no genetic differences versus individuals that do have genetic differences. So we have a little bit of logic here. So we're going to keep that in the back of our minds as we talk about different kinds of studies that can give us some information on relative contributions of genes and the environment. So first off, putting twins on the back burner for a minute, we can talk about family studies, and then we can talk adoption studies. So family studies are what they sound like. We're going to look at families, and we're going to look at the expression of particular traits. We're going to look at the phenotypes across families. So here we have a pedigree. And usually when you're in, say, bio classes, we'll talk about pedigrees in terms of non-human animals. But you can actually do this with people. So in this case, we're looking at, so here would be the first generation. And neither of these individuals have our trait of interest. They're both sort of empty circle squares. So circles are females, squares are males. And here, neither of them have the trait. Then we look down here and we see the lines connect. So we're saying they have 1, 2, 3 children who marry and have children of their own. But these 3 children, the 2 females, the 2 daughters they had, don't have the trait. They're also empty circles. But this son here is a filled in square. So square tells us son, filled in tells us they have the trait. I don't really care if you can tell the difference between circles and squares, but I'm just showing you that we can look at these symbols and say, aha, they've passed this thing on to their son, even though they didn't display the trait themselves. And when we look, the daughters that didn't show this particular trait, their phenotype says we don't have maybe a diagnosis, they can still have offspring where that trait shows up later on. So if this was something like most of the examples when we talk family studies are schizophrenia, simply because that is the longest and most widely studied of our psychological disorders. So we'll use that as an example here. But if we're saying that parents who themselves do not have a diagnosis of schizophrenia can have children who do, and they can have non-schizophrenia diagnosed children who themselves have offspring down the line that do, we're saying that there must be some heritable component here. And the more individuals that we see throughout a family tree that have that trait, the more certain we are that there is some inherited component to that trait. So we can start looking at things like, what's the pattern of inheritance? So from this one, we actually see that this is only expressed in males. So rather than this one being schizophrenia, which doesn't have the same kind of sex differences as a lot of other things, this would be, say, color blindness, which is almost it's significantly more likely to happen in males than females. And we don't need to get into why. But because we're seeing only males have this, we can make some claim about that pattern of inheritance. We can also start making calculations where if within this family we have 3 individuals out of, let's say, 20 people who have this particular diagnosis, well, outside of the family, maybe it's only 1 in 100 that have it. So we can look at the relative odds of having this disorder within the family versus without the family. And if it's a lot more common within the family, then we have some hints that this is something with a genetic component, something about inheriting it from your family members. So very basic studies. And this is something that they were able to start doing like long before we had any understanding of genetics as we do today. So this wouldn't be tying it to specific genes. This is just saying, all right, we see this pattern and this is what that pattern means. We can then get into adoption studies. And in this case, we're banking on the fact that we can vary your environment. So the two things that we typically consider are having a shared environment or having a non-shared environment. So it makes sense. Shared environment is you are raised together. A non-shared environment would mean that you're being raised in different locations. So there isn't an overlap in your environmental exposures. So adoption studies are really common in psychology where we make use of the fact that when individuals are adopted, they are taken in by non-biological relatives. So if we look at adopted children and we look at, say, in this case, again, I said schizophrenia is very common. We're going to use schizophrenia as an example. We're going to say, all right, if a child is diagnosed with schizophrenia, what are the chances that their biological parents had schizophrenia? If their biological parents are very likely to have had schizophrenia too, that gives us a hint that there was maybe a biological component because these children, they share genes with their biological parents, but they weren't raised by their biological parents. So they had different environments. But even though they were in different environments, they both still had the diagnosis. Therefore, we have some evidence that there's probably some biological contribution. We also want to consider, though, are these children who have schizophrenia, how likely are their adoptive parents to have schizophrenia? Because in those cases, adoptive parents don't share genetics, they don't have that biological equivalence, but they do share an environment. And if we end up finding that they are not similar to their adoptive parents, we'd say the environment is probably not having a strong contribution. We have to consider sort of multiple sides of things to make a distinctive claim to actually say calculate a heritability coefficient. But our logic here, the basic simplified interpretation, says that if we are more similar to our biological relatives and less similar to the non-biological parents that we were raised with, we would say that there is more of a biological contribution, a genetic contribution. If, in contrast, we find that the children are more similar to their adoptive parents, who they share an environment with, but less similar to their biological parents, then we have some evidence that there is an environmental contribution. So from our diagram here, we actually find that when there's sort of biological relatedness, children who have schizophrenia are also more likely to have biological parents that have schizophrenia. But when we look at adoptive relatives, there's really no link between an adopted child having schizophrenia and their adoptive parents having it. So they're more similar to their biological parents, therefore there's a biological genetic contribution. This is one of those cases where schizophrenia actually has a very high concordance rate. So their heritability coefficient is around 0.8, so very, very influenced by the genetics when we look at that particular population and variation. If we looked at something like a political party, you are more likely to be similar to the people who raised you in terms of your beliefs towards politics or religion than due to genetics. So in those cases, we'd say that that's something that's influenced by your environment and not your genes. So that's how we would interpret these things. And of course, if I was telling you something like, in an adoption study, we find that adopted children are similar to their biological parents, but not similar to their adoptive parents, you would know that I'm giving you information about the genes contributing to that trait. Or if I tell you they're more similar to their adoptive parents, but not biological parents, then you know I'm telling you about the environment. And then, of course, we can get into twin studies. And this ties us back to our identical versus fraternal twins, where now we have twins who are going to have all of their genes are the same. And like we said with our plants, if our genes are the same, but we still see differences in our phenotype, Well, then it can't be the genes creating those differences. Therefore, there must be a contribution of the environment. Whereas if the environment is held constant and there's variation in our genes and we see phenotype differences, then we know that the genes are playing a role. So these twin studies are actually a really nice way of looking at our different types of twins and how much genetics they share and how similar they are and how that all interrelates. So, with our adoption studies, we were really focused on the fact that we have individuals sort of raised in the same environment as their biological parents or not, and kind of considering like our how closely we related we are to our biological parents, and if that makes us more or less similar to them. This is sort of looking at the same stuff, but from a slightly different angle. With our twin studies, if we have just a pure twin study, we're really just looking at different types of twins raised together who end up having more or fewer shared genes. We can also get really fancy and actually combine twin and adoption studies where you can have identical and fraternal twins who are raised together or raised apart, meaning they're adopted out. And that gives us even more information. But typically, for any given trait, we usually want to look at multiple types of studies. So, like I said, with schizophrenia, they did lots of family studies. They've also done tons of adoption studies and tons of twin studies because the more of these different types of studies that have fairly consistent results, say indications that there's a strong genetic contribution and less of an environmental contribution, then that makes us more confident in that kind of interpretation. And these twin studies have been around for a pretty long time. Francis Galton comes back once again for having conducted our first recent twin study back in the late 1800s, which is pretty interesting. But rather than getting into a whole bunch of sort of the behind the scenes and the history of this, we just want to focus on the logic here. So, with our twin studies, if it's mainly going to have a genetic contribution, if we have a trait that is strongly influenced by genes, then we'd find that our monozygotic twins, our identical twins, the ones that share all of their genes, they should definitely be more similar than our dizygotic twins because dizygotic twins only share about 50% of their genes. So if genes contribute to this trait, to the variation of this trait in this population, again, sort of assuming all of those things being said in the background, if we are seeing that genetic contribution, our monozygotic twins should be much more similar than dizygotic. So if we were calculating, here we have our concordance rate. Again, it's always schizophrenia. Identical twins have a fairly high concordance rate. If we start looking at, so identical twins versus fraternal twins, that's a pretty big difference. Our fraternal twins, those dizygotic twins, are much less similar to each other. So if twin A has schizophrenia, twin B has almost 50% odds of also being diagnosed with schizophrenia if they're identical twins. If they're fraternal twins, though, if twin A has schizophrenia, twin B is only about 20% likely to have schizophrenia themselves. So we see that big difference between the two, which gives us evidence that there's going to be a strong genetic contribution. However, if our environment is the strong contribution and it's not so much our genes, well, then the fact that our different types of twins have differing similarities in terms of their genetics shouldn't actually matter. If the environment is what's driving the variation in a trait, then whether they share all their genes or only half doesn't really matter. And so, like I said, religion is something that is environmentally influenced. Very little would be tied back to genetics, if anything. And therefore, whether you have all your genes the same or only half your genes the same, you're not really going to be more or less similar. So that's our logic here for our twin studies. And if we want to take it one step further and look at those twin and adoption studies combined, this diagram is a little bit less pretty to look at, but if we focus just at the top here, and we're looking at identical twins, so we have identical twins, but in two columns. And the reason for that is we are looking at, is there a shared environment? So identical twins that have a shared environment, that just means that they were raised in the same household. For the second one here, though, identical twins who did not share an environment, that means that they were adopted into separate households. So we know that identical twins, regardless of how they were raised, share all of their genes. But we have here these ones, they share all of their genes and then they also shared an environment. This other group, though, they share all their genes but didn't share an environment. If environmental contributions sort of affect this trait, we'll see that our correlation scores or our heritability coefficients or whatever value we want, we would see that being in the same environment would make them more similar and not being in the same environment would make them less similar. And that's exactly what we see here. If it was a situation where there was no influence of environment, well, then these two things would be the exact same value, because as long as they share all their genes, they should have the same scores here. But because we see that having a shared environment or not has an influence on that contribution of how similar they are to each other, that tells us that there's definitely going to be an environmental contribution. And then if we wanted to look at shared environment and then identical twins versus fraternal twins, so we ignore this middle one here, and we're seeing identical twins raised together versus fraternal twins raised together. If there is a genetic contribution, then the identical twins should be more similar to each other, and the fraternal twins should be less similar to each other. And that's exactly what we see here. So 0.6 versus 0.86, that shows that yes, there is an environmental contribution from these guys, but there is also a genetic contribution from these guys as well. So we can interpret these three things to give us an idea that yes, genes play a role, and yes, the environment plays a role too. Now, I'm going to end this recording here, even though we're not quite done the slides, and then I'll do another one to finish up the last couple.